I remember the temperature of the message when it first arrived. Not heat, exactly, but a sensation like warmth bleeding through frozen metal, the psychic equivalent of touching something that shouldn't be generating its own temperature. 37 years I had served as Astropath Transcendent aboard the relay station orbiting Gora Secundus, and in that time I had received 14,693 transmissions through the screaming chaos of the warp. I knew the texture of desperation, the frequency of battle-cant emergency protocols, the particular psychic signature that marked a navigator's death scream as their ship plunged into a warp storm. This was different. This felt like someone whispering through a door that had been welded shut and buried under a mountain of corpses 5 years ago. The relay chamber was kept at precisely 12 degrees Celsius to prevent our augmetic cooling systems from overheating during extended reception periods. But my skin prickled with phantom warmth as the transmission coalesced in my mind. I sat in my receiving throne, a Baroque construction of blessed copper wiring and human bone that had cradled 17 astropaths before me. My body held in place by neural interface cables that ran directly into the base of my skull, where my third and fourth vertebrae had been replaced with sanctified data ports. The chamber smelled of ozone and the particular sweetness of the sacred oils they used to anoint the psychic dampening wards that lined every surface. Through my ruined eye sockets, burned hollow during my soul binding 39 years ago, when the Emperor's psychic presence had seared through my consciousness on Terra, I could sense the geometries of the room through the warp's reflection, seeing what my flesh had been blinded to. The message came through clearly. Too clearly. Astropathic communication was rarely precise. We dealt in emotional impressions, symbolic imagery, fragments of thought that had to be assembled like broken pottery to discern their meaning. But this transmission arrived with the coherent structure of a vox communication, each thought distinct and ordered. I felt the sender's designation before I heard his name, Astropath Secundus Thomas Verlaine, soul-bound in the year 937. M41, assigned to the cargo hauler Infinite Temperance. Registry mark Theta Sigma 997. Transcendent Caius, the message began, and I felt my designation like a hand touching my shoulder. Emergency Protocol Vermilion. Hull breach at Section 7 Alpha. Warp translation failing. Geller fields at 17%. Requesting immediate. I severed the connection with a thought, my psychic defenses slamming shut like bulkhead doors in a void ship's spine. My breathing came in ragged gasps that echoed in the chamber's recycled air. Around me, the other members of the receiving choir stirred in their thrones, sensing my distress to the psychic resonance we shared. Astropath Primus Morton, whose tenure exceeded mine by 2 decades, turned his eyeless face toward my position. Brother Caius, his voice emerged as a wet rasp, larynx damaged by the same warp corruption that had turned his skin the color of old parchment. Your disruption carries the taste of fear. Share the burden. I formed the words carefully, speaking aloud because the transmission had contaminated my psychic channels with something I didn't want to spread through mental contact. I received a message from Astropath Secundus Thomas Verlaine of the Infinite Temperance. Silence, save for the eternal hum of the relay station's plasma reactors deep in the lower decks. Then Morton spoke, each word measured. The Infinite Temperance was destroyed 5 years ago in the Hadron Nebula. Complete structural failure during warp translation. There were no survivors. The incident is recorded in the Disaster Archives, Incident Classification Code Sigma Black 7. I know. My hands gripped the arms of my receiving throne hard enough that the brass fixtures dug into my palms. I processed the casualty reports myself. Verlaine's psychic signature was logged as terminated, his soul markers extinguished. But I just received an emergency transmission from him. Active, coherent. Impossible. The other astropaths in the chamber began to murmur, a sound like wind through a catacomb. We dealt daily with the impossible. Our very existence was a blasphemy against the natural laws of reality. our minds forced open to a dimension that mankind was never meant to perceive. But there were degrees of impossibility, and this transcended them. The dead did not transmit. Souls consumed by the warp did not maintain enough coherence to send formatted emergency protocols. I reopened my psychic channels with the caution of a man diffusing an explosive, extending my consciousness into the warp like dipping a finger into acid. The message was still there, waiting, patient. I could feel Verlaine's presence now, a psychic signature that matched the records perfectly. The particular rhythm of his thought patterns, the unique frequency of his soul binding. Even the minor corruption in his third psychic resonance chamber that had been noted in his medical files 7 years ago. Transcendent Caius. The message resumed exactly where it had stopped, as if no time had passed. Geller fields failing. I can hear them in the walls. The crew is a burst of psychic static, the sensation of screaming translated into pure thought. Section 9 through 14 are gone. The navigator is dead. His eyes melted. I'm sealing myself in the astropathic chamber. I can still reach you. I can still... The message fractured into sensory impressions. I felt what Verlaine felt. The temperature dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius as the warp bled through failing reality barriers, the smell of ozone and burning insulation and something else, something that had no terrestrial comparison. A scent like rotting starlight and crystallized screams. I heard what he heard, metal grinding against itself in ways that violated three-dimensional geometry, voices speaking in frequencies that made blood vessels rupture. The wet sounds of human bodies being restructured by entities that viewed flesh as infinitely malleable clay. I documented everything. That was my function, my purpose, the reason the Emperor had burned out my eyes and branded his mark upon my soul. I sub-vocalized into the recording servitor that squatted beside my throne like a malformed child, its cortex replaced with archival storage systems and its fingers fused to the brass keys of a transcription engine. The servitor's biological components had belonged to a scribe who had failed the administratum's efficiency quotas. Now it served a higher purpose, transformed into a tool that could not forget or err. When the message finally ended, I felt Verlaine's consciousness retreat back into whatever impossible space it occupied. Not severed, retreating. The difference was crucial. A severed connection ended abruptly, like a cable being cut. This felt like someone stepping back from a door, but remaining close enough to knock again later. I reported the anomaly immediately. Protocol demanded it. Strange manifestations in astropathic communication were not merely investigated. They were treated as potential heresy, possible corruption, or worse, as accurate intelligence that the Imperium was unprepared to acknowledge. Within 6 hours, Nagos Investitor Hadronvelt arrived via high-priority shuttle from the nearest Mechanicus installation. Accompanied by 2 servo-skull units and an inquisitorial observer whose name I was never given, and whose face was hidden behind a brass mask worked with wards against psychic intrusion. They questioned me in a sealed chamber for 11 hours. The inquisitorial observer said nothing, merely observed while Velt's augmented voice, processed through 3 layers of voxcasters embedded in what remained of his throat, asked the same questions from 17 different angles. Had I consumed any substances that might alter psychic perception? Had I experienced any dreams of unusual vividness in the past 6 months? Did I harbor any doubts about the Emperor's protection? Had I noticed any changes in my psychic abilities that might suggest warp taint? I answered truthfully because lying to an inquisitorial observer was suicide, and lying to a Magos was simply impossible. Their augmented senses could detect the micro-expressions that preceded falsehood, could measure the minute changes in body temperature and neural activity that betrayed deception. And I had nothing to hide. The message was real. I knew this with the certainty that I knew my own name, my own soul signature. Velt examined my neural interface connections, ran diagnostic algorithms through my psychic dampening augmetics, even had me submit to a limited psychic examination where a sanctioned telepath, a thin man whose body trembled constantly from the neural degradation that telepathy inflicted, probed the surface of my thoughts looking for corruption. They found nothing. My soul binding remained intact, the Emperor's mark burning within my consciousness like a brand that would never fade. I was clean, untainted, and I had received a message from a dead man. The transmission's authentication codes are genuine, Velt concluded, his mechadendrites clicking against each other in a rhythm that suggested agitation. The psychic signature matches archived records of Astropath Secundus Verlaine with 99.7% accuracy. The message content is consistent with the Infinite Temperance's last known status before it was lost. Everything about this communication is authentic except for the fact that it should be impossible. The inquisitorial observer finally spoke, voice rendered flat and emotionless by the vox grill in his mask. Continue monitoring. Document all further communications. If the source attempts contact again, engage fully and extract maximum intelligence. We must understand this phenomenon. And if it's a trap, I asked, immediately regretting the question. One did not question inquisitorial commands. The observer's masked face turned toward me. Then you will spring it, and we will learn from your corruption what threatens the Imperium. Your service, Astropath, is not yours to withhold. They left me in my relay chamber with instructions to maintain my standard reception duties while remaining alert for any recurrence of the impossible transmission. Primus Morton assigned 2 additional astropaths to form a resonance triangle with me. Secundus Hask and Tertius Venn, both veterans of decades of service, whose psychic signatures I knew as well as my own. If the message came again, they would witness it, corroborate it, and if I showed signs of corruption, they would have enough combined psychic strength to sever my connection to the warp before I could spread whatever taint I'd been exposed to. The message came again 6 hours later, during the 3rd watch when the relay station's minimal crew operated at reduced capacity, and the warp's tides ran strongest through our sector. I felt Verlaine's presence like someone tapping insistently on a door that only I could perceive. He's here, I transmitted to Hask and Venn through our psychic link. Stand by for resonance sharing. I opened my mind to the transmission and simultaneously lowered the barriers that separated my consciousness from my fellow astropaths, allowing them to experience what I experienced. Verlaine's message came through with that same impossible clarity. Transcendent Caius. Thank the Emperor. I thought. I wasn't sure anyone was listening. The ship is gone. I know the ship is gone. I remember it breaking apart around me. I remember the Geller field collapse and the things that came through the walls. I remember dying. A pause, filled with a sensation that could only be described as psychic confusion. But I'm still here. I don't understand how I'm still here. I formed a response carefully, projecting my thoughts into the warp with the precision that 3 decades of practice had instilled. Verlaine, this is Transcendent Caius Mordant, Gora's Secundus Relay Station. Confirm your current location and status. The response came faster than any normal astropathic communication should allow. I'm in the chamber. My chamber. The astropathic sanctum aboard the Infinite Temperance. I sealed myself in when the Geller fields failed. I can still see the emergency lighting, red and flickering. I can still smell the incense from the purification sensors. But everything outside the chamber is wrong. When I try to sense beyond the walls, I feel nothing. No ship. No crew. Just screaming that goes on forever. Hask and Venn both recoiled from the shared psychic link, their horror bleeding into my consciousness. Venn's mental voice carried undertones of panic. He doesn't know he's dead. His soul is trapped in a memory of his last moments, suspended in the warp's currents. It made a terrible kind of sense. The warp was not bound by linear time or conventional physics. It was emotion and thought given impossible substance, where the past and future existed simultaneously, and reality bent according to the whims of entities that predated humanity's evolution. If Verlaine's soul had been cast into the warp at the moment of his death, if his psychic training had allowed him to maintain cohesion when any normal human would have dissolved instantly, he might exist in a state of perpetual dying, experiencing his last moments in an eternal loop. "Verlaine," I transmitted, choosing my words with care, "you are experiencing temporal displacement due to warp exposure. The infinite temperance was lost 5 years ago. You need to accept this and let go." Silence. Then, 5 years? No, that's not possible. It's only been... How long has it been? The chronometer is broken. The emergency power should have run out by now. I should have run out of air. Why haven't I run out of air? I could feel his consciousness fragmenting as understanding forced its way through his denial. The psychic equivalent of a man realizing he was looking at his own corpse. Ven began reciting prayers to strengthen our psychic defenses, litanies that dated back to the earliest days of the Imperium, words that mankind had used for 10,000 years to ward off the predations of the warp. "Listen to me," I transmitted with as much authority as I could project. "Your soul binding is keeping you coherent, but you cannot remain in this state. You must release your hold on physical existence and allow the Emperor's light to guide you." The Emperor's light. Verlaine's presence felt hollow, like an echo in a vast chamber. "I don't see any light. I only see darkness and the things that move in it. They're outside my chamber now. I've been listening to them for so long. They scratch at the doors. They whisper my name. They promise they can make the scratching stop if I just open the door." Horror crystallized in my consciousness, not just trapped, but besieged. Verlaine's soul wasn't simply suspended in the warp. It was being actively hunted by the entities that dwelt there, the daemons and predator spirits that fed on human consciousness, like sharks circling a bleeding swimmer. His astropathic training and soul binding were keeping him intact, but it was only a matter of time before his defenses eroded. "Do not open the door," I commanded, pouring every ounce of my will into the transmission. "Whatever they promise is a lie. You know this. Your training taught you this." "I know." The psychic equivalent of a bitter laugh. "I know what they are. I know what they want, but I'm so tired, Caius. I've been holding the door closed for so long, I don't even remember what it feels like not to be afraid." The transmission ended there, not severed but fading like a voice disappearing into distance. I sat in my receiving throne, trembling from the psychic exertion, feeling Hask and Ven's presence withdrawing from our shared link. Neither of them spoke aloud, but I felt their horror and pity through the psychic impressions that leaked from their damaged defenses. "Report this to the Magos," Hask finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The inquisitorial observer needs to know. A soul trapped in the warp is a vulnerability that could be exploited." I made my report. Velt returned with additional monitoring equipment, arcane machines that measured psychic frequencies and analyzed the warp's localized fluctuations. The inquisitorial observer brought a lex mechanic who documented every word of my account, his augmented memory banks recording my testimony with perfect fidelity for analysis and archival. They installed additional wards around my receiving throne, blessed copper symbols inscribed with the Emperor's name and sealed with the wax from sacred candles that had burned in Terra's highest temples. "Continue your contact," the observer commanded. "Extract information about his current state. Document the degradation of his soul binding. This data will prove valuable in understanding warp-based threats to Imperial astropathic networks." They were using me as an investigative tool, using Verlaine's slow dissolution as a research opportunity. I understood the logic. One soul already lost versus potential protection for the millions of astropaths who served across the Imperium. But understanding didn't make it easier when Verlaine's presence knocked at my consciousness again 12 hours later. "Caius, His psychic voice carried a new quality now, something that suggested he'd had time to think, to process, to begin truly comprehending his situation. I've been trying to remember everything, trying to hold on to who I was, but pieces keep falling away. I can't remember my mother's face anymore. I used to be able to picture her perfectly. She had this scar above her left eyebrow from when she fell off a grain thresher when she was a child. But now, when I try to see her, there's just nothing. An empty space where her face should be. I had no comfort to offer. Memory loss was inevitable in our profession, even for the living. The warp eroded human consciousness through mere exposure. For someone literally immersed in its currents, the degradation would be exponentially faster. "Tell me about yourself," I transmitted. "Tell me your memories while you still have them. I'll document them. You won't be forgotten." It seemed like such a small mercy, pathetically inadequate. But Verlaine seized on it with desperate gratitude, and for the next subjective hour, time being meaningless in psychic communication, he spoke. He told me about growing up on an agri world called Vanheim's Rest, where the summers lasted 9 months, and the winters could kill you if you strayed too far from the thermal generators. He told me about manifesting his psychic abilities at age 14, setting fire to a barn with his mind during a moment of adolescent rage. He told me about the black ships arriving, about being taken to Terra in chains alongside 200 other psykers, about the 83 who died during the journey when their powers overwhelmed them or when they were executed for showing signs of corruption. He told me about the soul-binding ceremony. This was something all astropaths shared, a defining trauma that marked us forever. He described kneeling in a chamber so vast that its ceiling was lost in darkness, one of 500 psykers assembled in concentric rings around the golden throne itself. He described the moment when the Emperor's consciousness touched his own, not gentle, not kind, but absolutely overwhelming, a psychic presence so vast that individual human minds were like candle flames before a nova furnace. "It burned," Verlaine transmitted, and I felt the echo of that ancient agony bleeding through his words. It burned away everything I thought I was. My eyes melted in their sockets, my thoughts scattered like ash in a wind. And through the burning, I felt him, the Emperor. Not the god they tell us about in the sermons. Something older. Something that looked at me and saw a tool that might be useful. He marked me, claimed me, and when the burning stopped, I wasn't human anymore. I was something that could survive in the space between stars, something that could hear voices in the warp screaming and translate them into words the Imperium could understand. Every astropath knew this truth, but we rarely spoke it aloud. The soul binding didn't protect us from the warp. It transformed us into something that could endure exposure long enough to be useful before we inevitably broke. We were expendable components in the Imperium's vast communicative machinery, our suffering justified by the billions of messages we relayed across the galaxy. If this glimpse into Verlaine's torment already weighs on your heart, honor his sacrifice. Leave a comment with the word "witnessed" and subscribe so his story endures. The messages continued. Verlaine reached out to me every 12 to 14 hours, the intervals varying in ways that suggested the warp's non-linear time was affecting his perception. Sometimes he spoke coherently, sharing more memories or asking questions about the Imperium he'd left behind. Other times his transmissions were fragmented, broken by what sounded like screaming, or by long stretches of dead psychic space, where I could feel his presence but receive no coherent thoughts. "The scratching has stopped," he told me during what my chronometer indicated was the 17th day of contact, though to Verlaine it might have been minutes or centuries. "The things outside my chamber have stopped scratching. That should be good news, but it terrifies me. Why did they stop? What are they doing?" I had no answers. The inquisitorial observer had consulted with an actual inquisitor who specialized in demonology, and the assessment had been grim. The entities besieging Verlaine's soul fragment were likely testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses, waiting for his soul binding to erode enough that they could breach his psychic barriers. The scratching had stopped because they no longer needed to force entry. They could afford to wait. "Talk to me," Verlaine transmitted with an edge of panic. "Please." The silence is worse than the scratching. When they were making noise, I knew where they were. Now I don't know if they're still out there or if they're inside the chamber with me. I can't see anything. My psychic senses only show me the warp, and the warp doesn't have directions or distance. I could be surrounded by 1,000 daemons and not know it until they touched me. So I talked. I violated a dozen protocols about maintaining professional psychic barriers and engaged in genuine conversation with a dead man's ghost. I told him about the relay station, about the other astropaths in my choir, about the mundane details of existence that had continued for 5 years while he'd been trapped in his eternal moment. I told him about Primus Morton's habit of humming machine-cant hymns during reception hours, about Secundus Hask's obsessive documentation of every psychic anomaly he encountered, about Tertius Ven's collection of prayer beads carved from the bones of previous astropaths. I told him things I'd never spoken aloud about what it meant to serve as we served, the constant low-grade pain from our neural interfaces, the taste of copper that never left our mouths, the way our bodies degraded faster than baseline humans because psychic exposure literally burned calories from our flesh. I'd lost 40 kilograms since my soul binding, my body consuming itself to fuel powers that defied natural law. The dreams we all experienced, nightmares of drowning in an ocean of screaming faces, of being pulled apart by invisible hands, of looking at ourselves from the outside and seeing something that had stopped being human years ago. "At least you're honest about it," Verlaine responded. "They never told us during training that service meant slow suicide. They dressed it up in glory and duty and the Emperor's protection. But we both know the truth. We're psychic sewage workers, wading through the warp's filth so the Imperium's messages can get through. And when we break, they'll replace us with the next batch of psychers who don't yet understand what they've signed up for." He wasn't wrong. I'd processed the casualty reports for our sector. Astropaths had an average service life of 23 years post-soul binding. The oldest serving astropath in Imperium records had lasted 79 years before his mind finally shattered during a particularly difficult transmission. I was 37 years into my service. Statistically, I was past my expected lifespan. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Verlaine's messages continued with mechanical regularity, and I began to structure my schedule around them. Wake at third watch, perform ritual ablutions to cleanse my psychic channels, receive standard transmissions during fourth and fifth watch, then wait for Verlaine's presence to manifest. The relay station's other astropaths thought I was becoming obsessed, perhaps even corrupted by prolonged exposure to an anomalous psychic phenomenon. They might have been right, but I couldn't stop. Because Verlaine needed this. Needed someone to witness his slow dissolution, to acknowledge that he'd existed, that his suffering had meaning. And I needed it too, in ways I didn't fully understand. His honest horror about our profession forced me to confront truths I'd buried under layers of duty and denial. We were broken tools, all of us, used and discarded. Our reward for faithful service was not salvation, but transformation into something worse than death. I saw one today, Verlaine transmitted during the 3rd month, one of the things outside my chamber. It forced part of itself through a crack in the door. I don't know when the crack appeared. Maybe it was always there. Maybe the door is eroding like everything else. It looked like, I don't have words. It looked like a hand made of screaming, like fingers constructed from compressed agony. It reached toward me, and I felt its touch in my soul, tasting what I am, testing whether I'm ready to be consumed. "What did you do?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. I prayed. I recited every litany of protection they taught me on Terra. I remembered the Emperor's touch during my soul binding, and I tried to hold that memory like a shield. And the thing withdrew, not because it was hurt or afraid, because it wasn't hungry enough yet. It's waiting for me to weaken. They're all waiting. I reported this to the inquisitorial observer, who had maintained constant surveillance of my communications with Verlaine. The response was terse. Continue monitoring. Document the final stages. The final stages. They were waiting for Verlaine to break completely so they could study what happened when a soul-bound astropath finally surrendered to the warp. Using his doom as research data. Using me as the instrument to document it. Should they have had a choice? I wanted to scream. Should any of us? But I knew the answer. Choice was not a luxury the Imperium could afford. Every psychic human was a potential doorway for demonkind, a crack in reality through which the warp could bleed. Better to use us, to burn through our lives in service, than to risk what we might become if left unsanctioned and untrained. Verlaine's messages grew more fractured as the months accumulated. He began to lose track of our previous conversations, asking me the same questions multiple times, forgetting details he'd shared days before. His psychic signature started developing anomalies, harmonics that shouldn't exist, frequencies that hurt to perceive, undertones of something utterly inhuman creeping into his transmissions, like corruption spreading through clean water. Caius, he transmitted during the 6th month, his presence feeling thinner, more transparent, like paper that had been handled too many times. I can't remember what I looked like. I'm trying to picture my face, and there's nothing. No features, no details, just a blank space where I should be. Am I forgetting myself, or was I never really here in the first place? You're Thomas Verlaine, I transmitted firmly. Born on Vanheim's Rest in 1919. M41. Soul-bound in 937. M41. Assigned to the Infinite Temperance as Astropath Secundus. You served faithfully until your ship was lost. You are real. Your service mattered. Did it? The question carried such profound exhaustion that I felt it as a physical weight. I transmitted messages I never understood, for people I never met, about wars I never saw. I spent my entire adult life sitting in a chamber not much larger than a coffin, burning my consciousness down to nothing, so someone on the other side of the galaxy could receive orders or reports or requisition forms. What kind of life is that? What kind of meaning does that have? I had no answer that didn't sound hollow, because he was right. Our lives were measured in transmissions relayed and years survived, not in relationships formed or experiences gained, or any normal metric of human existence. We were machines wrapped in dying flesh, functions rather than people. At least you're not alone now, I offered, knowing it was inadequate. At least someone hears you. Yes. A bitter laugh, the psychic equivalent of a smile with no joy. I'm not alone in my eternal dying. What a comfort. The scratching started again during the 8th month. Verlaine's transmissions grew panicked, desperate, interspersed with bursts of psychic static that felt like nails being driven into my consciousness. The entities in the warp had grown patient, and now their patience had ended. They're inside, Verlaine transmitted, his psychic voice breaking into fragments. The door is open. I don't remember opening it. Maybe I didn't. Maybe there never was a door. Maybe I've been exposed this whole time and only just realized it. They're touching me. They're pulling at the pieces of my soul binding, unraveling the Emperor's mark like someone picking apart a knot. It hurts. Emperor above, it hurts worse than the soul binding did, because this time I'm being unmade instead of remade. Hold on. I transmitted uselessly. Remember your training. Remember your oaths. My oaths. Verlaine's laughter was the sound of something breaking. I oathed to serve the Emperor until death. I've been dead for 5 years. My oaths are fulfilled. My service is complete. Why am I still here? Why won't he let me go? I felt the moment when the daemons began to feed in earnest. Verlaine's psychic signature started to distort, to corrupt, pieces of his consciousness being torn away and consumed by entities that experienced human souls the way humans experienced a particularly fine meal. He screamed. Not with his voice. He had no voice, no body, no physical existence. He screamed directly into my mind, and I screamed with him because our connection was still active, and his agony bled through our psychic link like acid through flesh. Primus Morton and 4 other astropaths had to physically restrain me to prevent me from clawing my own face off. I thrashed in my receiving throne while Verlaine's dissolution played out in real time across my consciousness. I felt his memories being devoured, his mother's face, his childhood home, his first kiss, his last meal, every moment of his existence consumed by things that fed on experience itself. I felt his identity fracturing, the core sense of self that made him Thomas Verlaine being scattered like ash in a hurricane. And through it all, I felt his terror, his desperate, hopeless terror as he finally understood that there was no escape, no mercy, no final rest, just consumption, just the eternal hunger of the warp claiming another victim. The transmission ended suddenly, severed so completely, it felt like a physical amputation. I lay in my restraints, gasping tears streaming from the empty sockets where my eyes had been, psychic feedback causing my nose to bleed and my neural interfaces to spark. Around me, the other astropaths were reciting emergency purification rituals, their combined psychic strength forcing my consciousness back into proper boundaries, sealing the channels through which Verlaine's doom had nearly pulled me into the warp with him. When I could finally think clearly enough to form words, I croaked out, "He's gone." "Yes," Morton confirmed, his scarred hands still gripping my shoulders. "The signature is extinguished. Whatever remained of Astropath Verlaine has been consumed. It is finished." I wanted to say something profound, some final acknowledgement of what had been lost. But what words could encompass the horror of a soul trapped for 5 years in the warp's embrace, besieged by daemons, slowly consumed while begging for release that never came? What liturgy could sanctify that kind of suffering? The inquisitorial observer arrived within the hour. He reviewed my physiological data, examined the psychic recording crystals that had captured fragments of Verlaine's final moments, and then delivered his assessment in that same flat, emotionless tone. "Valuable data has been acquired. The degradation pattern of a soul-bound consciousness exposed to prolonged warp immersion is now documented. Defensive protocols can be updated to prevent similar cases of post-mortem psychic anchoring. Your service has benefited the Imperium, Astropath Caius." He left, just like that. 8 months of communication with a dead man, witnessing his slow destruction, and the Inquisition's only concern was whether they'd learned anything useful for future applications. I tried to return to my normal duties, tried to resume the routine that had defined my existence for 3 decades. But something had broken inside me during those 8 months. Some fundamental acceptance of the Imperium's logic that had allowed me to function despite the horror of what we did. Verlaine's voice haunted me during every transmission, his questions echoing through my consciousness. What kind of life is this? What kind of meaning does that have? Primus Morton noticed my deterioration during the 2nd week after Verlaine's final dissolution. "You are compromised," he stated without judgment. "Extended exposure to an anomalous psychic phenomenon has degraded your operational stability. You require reconditioning." Reconditioning. A euphemism for having my memory partially erased, my consciousness stripped of traumatic experiences and rebuilt into something that could function again. It happened to approximately 30% of astropaths during their service, the psychic equivalent of a factory reset when a machine developed errors. No. The word emerged before I'd consciously decided to speak it. No reconditioning. I want to remember. He deserves to be remembered. "He was already dead," Morton said with the patient tone of someone explaining simple facts to a child. "His suffering ended 5 years ago when his ship was destroyed. What you witnessed was merely the delayed dissolution of a psychic echo, no more significant than a Vox recording continuing to play after its creator has departed." But that wasn't true. Verlaine had been conscious, aware, suffering. His entrapment in the warp had been as real as my own existence, perhaps more real given that the warp cared nothing for physical laws or temporal consistency. He had endured 5 years of siege by horrors beyond mortal comprehension, and the Imperium's response was to treat him as a research opportunity. "This cycle has repeated for millennia," I said quietly. "How many astropaths have been lost to similar fates? How many others are still out there, trapped in the warp, screaming to anyone who might hear them?" "Unknown," Morton admitted. "And irrelevant. We serve the function we were designed for. Questions of meaning or justice are beyond our purpose." He was right, of course. He was perfectly right. And that was the horror of it. I refused the reconditioning. This act of defiance earned me a formal reprimand and a reduction in status from Astropath Transcendent to Astropath Secundus, but I was not executed or mind-wiped forcibly. The Imperium needed every functional astropath it could maintain, and I was still capable of performing my duties despite the psychological damage. They assigned me to less critical communications, routine supply manifests, census data, bureaucratic transmissions that required minimal psychic strength and carried low risk of corruption. For 3 months, I existed in this diminished state, processing meaningless data while trying to reconcile what I'd witnessed with the faith that had sustained me through decades of service. "The Emperor protects," they told us. But the Emperor hadn't protected Verlaine. The Emperor's own mark upon his soul had kept him coherent long enough to suffer more completely than any unmarked human could have endured. The soul binding wasn't protection. It was a leash that kept us functional long past the point where mercy would have let us die. Then, during the 14th watch on what my chronometer indicated was the 97th day since Verlaine's final dissolution, I felt something impossible. A presence at the edge of my psychic awareness. Familiar, patient, waiting. I didn't want to acknowledge it. I tried to convince myself it was psychic feedback from my recent trauma, a phantom sensation like an amputee feeling sensation in a missing limb. But the presence persisted, and when I finally, reluctantly, fearfully, extended my consciousness toward it, the contact resolved into a coherent psychic signature. Verlaine, not precisely him. Not the personality I'd come to know through 8 months of communication. This felt like an impression, a psychic footprint left in the warp's substance, an echo that had somehow retained enough coherence to reach out, like a recording of a recording, degraded but recognizable. Caius. The transmission was fragmentary, thoughts arriving in broken sequences. Still here pieces, not all consumed. They missed. Fragments. Scattered. I remember you listening. Thank you. Thank you for... The message dissolved into psychic static before completing. I sat frozen in my receiving throne, my consciousness reeling from the implications. Verlaine had been consumed. I'd felt it happen. But something of him remained, some fragment that the daemons had either overlooked or found unpalatable. Still drifting in the warp's currents, still reaching out to the one person who had bothered to listen. I should have reported it immediately, should have summoned the inquisitorial observer and documented this new impossibility. Instead, I opened a channel and responded. "I'm here. I'm listening." What followed was less a conversation than an attempted reconstruction. The entity that had been Verlaine existed now as scattered fragments of consciousness, pieces of memory and personality that occasionally achieved enough proximity to form coherent thoughts. It, whatever this thing was, couldn't sustain contact for more than a few minutes at a time, and the intervals between transmissions were irregular, sometimes hours, sometimes days. But it kept reaching out, kept trying to communicate. "Can't die," one transmission said, just those 2 words repeating until I acknowledged them. "Can't die, can't die. Emperor won't let me die." Another transmission weeks later. "See others now. Lost souls, thousands, millions. All trapped, all screaming, warp is cemetery, warp is prison." The fragments painted a picture more horrifying than Verlaine's original entrapment. His consciousness, reduced to its most basic components, now perceived the warp without the filters that human psychology normally imposed. He could sense the other souls caught in the Immaterium's currents, psychers who had died during warp travel, astropaths whose ships had been destroyed, untold billions of humans who had perished with enough psychic potential that their souls hadn't immediately dissolved upon death. The warp was full of ghosts, an ocean of the dead, drowning forever in a dimension that refused to release them. The Imperium knows. Another transmission whispered directly into my consciousness during the 4th month of renewed contact. Always known. Soul binding makes it worse. Keeps us coherent. Keeps us aware. Suffering is the price. Suffering is the point. I wanted to deny it. Wanted to believe that the Imperium's methods, however brutal, served necessary purposes, but the evidence accumulated with each fragmentary transmission. The soul-binding ritual didn't just protect astropaths from the warp's predations. It fundamentally altered our soul's structure in ways that prevented clean dissolution after death. We were anchored to our psychic abilities even beyond mortality, condemned to awareness long past the point where baseline humans would have found oblivion. The Imperium had created a system where its psychic servants couldn't escape service even through death. I began conducting research during my off-duty hours, accessing the relay station's archival databases and requisitioning historical documents from the administrative networks I could reach through standard astropathic channels. The data I found supported Verlaine's fragmentary claims. References to post-mortem psychic phenomena appeared in restricted Adeptus Astra Telepathica documents dating back 6,000 years. Reports of astropaths experiencing contact with deceased colleagues appeared with statistical regularity. Approximately 1 case per 10,000 astropaths per year, almost always suppressed or explained away as warp-taint hallucination. The Imperium knew, had always known, and had classified this information as secret doctrine, restricted to the highest echelons of the telepathica hierarchy. Why? I transmitted to Verlaine's fragments during one of his more coherent periods. Why would they design the soul binding to trap us this way? The answer came in pieces across multiple transmissions. Can't risk. Fully trained astropaths, becoming demonic. Soul binding creates spiritual framework, too rigid for possession. Even in death, structure remains. Better eternal suffering than demonic corruption. Mathematics of acceptable loss. It was logical, perfectly, horrifically logical. An astropath alive was valuable. An astropath dead was merely unfortunate. But an astropath possessed by a demon could compromise entire communication networks, could send corrupted messages across the Imperium, could potentially doom worlds through intentionally garbled strategic intelligence. Better to ensure that even death didn't free an astropath's soul, that the same soul binding that granted power also served as eternal prison. We were too dangerous to be allowed true death. I stopped sleeping well. The few hours of rest I managed were plagued by nightmares where I saw myself from outside my body, a withered figure locked in a throne of bone and brass, transmitting messages forever while my soul screamed for release that would never come. I started losing weight again, my body consuming itself faster than the relay station's nutrient supplements could compensate. The other astropaths noticed my deterioration but said nothing. We all broke eventually. They were simply waiting to see how my breaking would manifest. Verlaine's fragments continued their irregular contact. Sometimes the transmissions were almost peaceful, containing observations about the warp's strange beauty, colors that had no names in any human language, geometries that violated three-dimensional space, the terrible majesty of entities so vast that human consciousness could only perceive the smallest fraction of their true forms. Other times, the transmissions were pure anguish, wordless suffering broadcast with enough intensity that I had to sever the connection before it overwhelmed my defenses. I spoke to another one today. A transmission informed me during the 7th month of renewed contact. Another astropath, lost 200 years ago. She remembers her name, keeps repeating it. Valeria Nost. Valeria Nost. Valeria Nost. Like an anchor, like if she stops saying her name, she'll forget it forever. Did you tell her about me? I asked. Tell her someone in real space can hear. Tried. She didn't understand. 200 years of dissolution. Not much left. Just name. Just fear. Just endless repetition. The image haunted me. 200 years of existence reduced to endlessly repeating your own name into the void, clinging to that single piece of identity while everything else eroded away. And if 200 years left so little, what would 2,000 years do? 20,000? The Imperium had existed for 10 millennia. How many Astropaths had died in its service during that span? How many souls drifted now in the warp, eternally conscious, eternally suffering, eternally unable to either fully exist or completely dissolve? Comment where you're watching from, I wanted to scream into the void. Let them know someone, somewhere, remembers their sacrifice. I began documenting everything in personal journals that I encoded using cipher protocols taught only to the highest-ranked astropaths. I recorded Verlaine's transmissions, cross-referenced them with historical data, compiled evidence of the Imperium's knowledge and intentional suppression of post-mortem psychic phenomena. I wasn't sure why I bothered. Exposing this information would accomplish nothing except my own execution for heresy, but the act of documentation felt like the only meaningful resistance available to me. Verlaine's fragments grew more coherent during the 8th month, as if the scattered pieces of his consciousness had learned to coordinate their movements through the warp. The transmissions lasted longer, contained more complex thoughts, occasionally even displayed flashes of his original personality, the bitter humor, the intellectual curiosity, the stubborn refusal to accept easy answers. "I've been thinking," one transmission began, a phrase so mundane and human it made me want to weep, "about what we were, what we are. They told us the soul binding was a gift, the Emperor's blessing, protection against the warp's predations. But it was never protection. It was consecration, making us sacred to his purpose. And sacred things can never be released from service. Churches don't demolish cathedrals just because they're old. Priests don't burn holy relics just because they're damaged. We were made sacred, and sacred things must serve forever. Even past death," I responded. "Even past sanity. Even past the point where service becomes meaningless. Yes, because the meaning isn't in our experience. The meaning is in the system's perpetuation. The Imperium doesn't care what we feel, only that we function. And if our soul's eternal torment serves some purpose in the warp's grand calculus, deterring demonic possession, maintaining psychic infrastructure, whatever, then our torment is justified." I had no counter-argument. Every point he made aligned with what I'd learned through my research. The Imperium operated on scales that rendered individual suffering meaningless. One soul in eternal torment was acceptable if it prevented one world from falling to chaos. 1,000,000 souls in eternal torment was acceptable if it maintained the astropathic network that held the Imperium together. The mathematics of damnation were surprisingly simple once you stopped caring about individual human experience. If you think the price was too high, I transmitted. Not sure who I was addressing anymore. Verlaine, myself, the universe at large. Then what do? We can't escape. We can't even die properly. The system is too vast to resist. "We witness," Verlaine responded. "We acknowledge. We refuse to pretend this is acceptable. Not for salvation. There is no salvation. Not for change. There will be no change. Just witness. Remember, make it mean something by refusing to look away." During the 10th month, Verlaine's transmissions began including information about other trapped souls he'd encountered in the warp. Astropath Primus Hadrian Vex, lost 300 years ago, his consciousness still coherent enough to remember entire passages from the Tactica Imperialis that he recited endlessly into the void. Astropath Tertius 97 Kappa, whose name had been replaced by an identification number during reconditioning, who had forgotten every human emotion except fear. Choir Master Selenius Cord, who had perished with his entire choir when their relay station suffered catastrophic Geller field failure, and whose consciousness was now fragmented across 17 separate psychic signatures that occasionally achieved enough proximity to scream in harmony. Each name was another weight added to the burden I carried. Each story was another piece of evidence that what happened to Verlaine wasn't aberration, but inevitable outcome. We were all doomed to this. Every astropath who died in service faced the same fate, souls too altered by the soul binding to dissolve cleanly, consciousness too trained in psychic disciplines to simply surrender, awareness preserved past all reason or mercy. I started making mistakes in my duties, transmitted messages with minor errors, missed subtle nuances in incoming communications, responded to standard protocols with microsecond delays that suggested degraded neural processing. The signs of an astropath approaching failure, the precursors to either death or complete psychological collapse. Primus Morton summoned me to his chambers during the 13th month of renewed contact with Verlaine. His eyeless face turned toward me with the uncanny accuracy of someone who could perceive through senses that had nothing to do with physical sight. "You are communicating with something," he stated flatly. "Not standard transmissions. Something else. Something you have deliberately concealed from choir oversight." I could have lied, should have lied. But exhaustion and despair had eroded my survival instinct past the point where deception seemed worthwhile. Yes, the entity designating itself as Verlaine? Fragments of it. What remains after consumption? Morton was silent for 17 seconds. I counted them, a nervous habit from decades of measuring time in precise increments. Then I suspected as much. Malak. No. Malak, the grim, the living Malak, the red devils, the red colors. The mischief pratic then seemed. This is cold. You are not the first astropath to experience post-mortem contact with deceased colleagues. You will not be the last. The casual confirmation of everything I discovered hit harder than I expected. You knew. The choir knows. The telepathica knows. And you've all maintained the secret. Knowledge of our post-mortem fate serves no purpose, Morton responded, with the inflectionless tone of someone reciting doctrine. It does not improve performance. It does not enhance survival. It merely introduces despair and potential heresy. Better that each astropath discovers this truth individually, if they discover it at all, than to contaminate entire generations with pre-existing dread. Better? The word emerged as half laugh, half sob. Better to let us serve in ignorance until we die, and discover the horror firsthand? Yes. No hesitation. No doubt. Because the alternative is systemic collapse of the Imperium's communication network. Because even knowing what awaits us, we must still serve. And humans do not serve well when they understand the full price they will pay. He was right. Emperor above. He was right. If every astropath knew that soul binding condemned them to potential eternal awareness after death, how many would serve faithfully? How many would resist? How many would choose death over service? Or worse, would turn to chaos in desperate hope of escape? The system worked because we didn't understand what we were signing up for until it was too late to matter. Now you understand what I understood 43 years ago, Morton continued. When I first experienced contact with Astropath Primus Octavian Vesh, who had trained me before his death. When I learned that his consciousness still existed in fragmentary form, still aware, still suffering. I faced the same choice you face now. Continue serving despite the knowledge, or resist and accomplish nothing except bringing punishment upon yourself. And you chose to serve. I chose to function, to fulfill my purpose. To accept that my preferences and desires are irrelevant compared to the Imperium's needs. He tilted his head in a gesture that might have been sad in someone with eyes to convey the emotion. You will make the same choice, or you will be reconditioned into making it, or you will be executed and discover firsthand what awaits us. But the outcome is inevitable. We do not have the luxury of meaningful resistance. I returned to my duties, not because I accepted Morton's logic, but because he was correct about the futility of resistance. I was one damaged astropath among millions serving across the galaxy. My knowledge changed nothing. My suffering mattered to no one except myself. I would serve until I broke, and then I would join Verlaine and Hadrian and 97 Kappa, and all the others in the warp's eternal cemetery, and another astropath would take my place in the receiving throne, and the system would continue exactly as it had for 10,000 years. The only choice left was whether to witness this horror with eyes open or closed. Verlaine's transmissions continued into the second year. His fragments had achieved stable enough configuration that contact became almost routine, just another part of my daily schedule alongside standard reception duties and mandatory psychic purification rituals. Sometimes we didn't exchange any meaningful communication, just a brief acknowledgement that we were both still existing in our respective hells, still conscious enough to recognize each other. Other times, we discussed philosophy, death, suffering, the nature of consciousness. Whether awareness without agency constituted existence or merely elaborate simulation thereof. Verlaine had 10,000 years of warp exposure ahead of him before his soul fragments finally eroded past the point of coherence. I had, perhaps, another 20 years of physical life before my body failed, followed by my own dissolution into scattered awareness drifting through impossible dimensions. "Do you regret it?" I asked him during one transmission. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you still accept the soul binding?" The answer took a long time to form. No. But the person I was before soul binding couldn't have understood enough to make an informed choice. They showed us just enough truth to terrify us into compliance. The black ships, the executions, the stories of unsanctioned psychers becoming demonic. They convinced us that soul binding was salvation. By the time we understood the real price, we'd already paid it. If you believe they deserved better, let your engagement be the testament the Imperium ignored. Like and subscribe so their voices aren't lost forever in the void. I began experiencing fragments of other trapped consciousnesses during the 15th month. Not coherent communication like Verlaine provided, but psychic impressions bleeding through during standard reception duties. Brief flashes of awareness that felt like distant voices calling through a storm. Sometimes I could identify them. Deceased astropaths whose obituaries I'd processed during my decades of service. Other times they were anonymous. Just the sensation of consciousness in torment, souls that had been dead for centuries or millennia but remained aware enough to scream. The warp wasn't just a medium for psychic communication. It was an afterlife, a hell, a dimension where human consciousness persisted past all reason, trapped in states of partial existence that defied comprehension. And the Imperium knew, had always known. Used this knowledge to design the soul-binding ritual in ways that maximized astropath effectiveness while accepting eternal damnation as acceptable collateral damage. How many? I asked Verlaine during the 18th month. How many souls are trapped like you? Uncountable. I can sense millions? More? The warp doesn't have census data, but everywhere I drift, I encounter others. Most are too fragmented to communicate. Just awareness, suffering, repetition, an ocean of the damned, drowning forever, and the Imperium uses us as its communication medium while pretending we don't exist. I thought about that. About every astropathic message transmitted across the galaxy traveling through a dimension literally filled with the tormented souls of dead psychers. About how the warp's psychic turbulence might be partially composed of consciousness in torment rather than purely chaotic emanations. About whether our messages caused additional suffering as they tore through the spaces where these fragments existed. The horror had layers I hadn't previously considered. It went down and down, each revelation opening new depths of systematic cruelty that the Imperium had deliberately engineered into its foundational infrastructure. Verlaine's messages began to change during the 20th month. The bitter anger and existential despair that had characterized his early transmissions gradually shifted towards something else. Not acceptance, he would never accept his fate, but a kind of grim determination. He started using his fragmentary existence to chart the warp's currents around our sector, mapping the psychic tides and identifying patterns that might prove useful for Imperial navigation. Might as well be useful, he transmitted when I questioned this. I'm going to be here for the next several millennia. Might as well spend the time observing, documenting. Maybe something I learn will save a ship. Maybe one fewer person will end up like me. It was the first hint of something resembling purpose I'd heard from him in months. You're still serving. Even now. Even after everything. Not serving the Imperium. Serving humanity. There's a difference. Even if the Imperium doesn't acknowledge it, every ship that arrives safely is carrying actual people, not just resources or combat assets. Every message that reaches its destination might help someone. I can't escape my damnation, but I can try to prevent others from sharing it. His example shamed me. I'd spent months wallowing in despair and philosophical horror while still performing my duties mechanically. But Verlaine, reduced to scattered fragments of consciousness, besieged by demons, trapped in eternal torment, had somehow found purpose in continued service. Not because authority demanded it, but because helping others remained possible even from hell. I began applying similar logic to my own existence. Yes, the system was irredeemably corrupt. Yes, we were condemned to eternal suffering. Yes, the Imperium viewed us as expendable components rather than people. But the messages I transmitted still mattered to the humans who received them. The supply manifests I relayed still meant food arriving at worlds where people would otherwise starve. The casualty reports I processed still allowed families to know their loved ones' fates. My suffering was real. The injustice was real, but the work still mattered. As this nightmare reaches its conclusion, if any part of this moved you, give them the one thing they never had, recognition. Leave eternal in the comments. The months accumulated into years. Verlaine's fragments persisted, maintained in their partial existence by the same soul binding that had created them. I continued my duties, advanced back to Astropath Transcendent after demonstrating stable performance despite my knowledge of what awaited me. Other astropaths died, natural attrition, the expected casualties of our profession. And sometimes I felt their souls' initial confusion as they discovered their consciousness hadn't dissolved with their bodies. I helped where I could, reached out to the newly dead and explained their situation, guided them through the first stages of fragmentation, introduced them to Verlaine and the other long-term fragments who had learned to maintain coherence, created an informal network of dead astropaths who supported each other through eternal damnation. The choir leadership knew what I was doing, didn't stop me. Because it improved efficiency, newly dead astropaths who understood their situation achieved stable fragmentation faster, caused fewer psychic disturbances, sometimes even continued providing useful intelligence about warp conditions. My heretical kindness served Imperial interests, so it was tolerated. Everything served Imperial interests, even damnation, even mercy. The Imperium was a system so vast and so perfectly optimized for its own perpetuation that resistance became indistinguishable from compliance. Every action either served the machine or was irrelevant to it. This is forever. Verlaine transmitted during what my chronometer indicated was the 4th anniversary of his original message. This is what we are now. Dead but aware. Damned but functional. Suffering but still serving. And it will continue until the Imperium falls, or the warp itself ends, or the heat death of the universe, whichever comes first. Yes, I acknowledged, because there was nothing else to say, no comfort to offer. no hope to provide. Just recognition of shared damnation and the grim determination to make our suffering mean something, however little. I received a new batch of freshly soul-bound astropaths during the 5th year of contact with Verlaine. 23 young psychers, their eyes still healing from the burns that had destroyed their vision, their minds still reeling from the Emperor's touch. Their souls now permanently marked and altered in ways they didn't yet understand. I watched them file into the relay station's orientation chamber, saw their fear and confusion and desperate hope that their sacrifice had purchased something meaningful. They looked exactly like I had looked 37 years ago, young and broken and idealistic. They believed the lies because they had to, because the truth would be unbearable. I wanted to tell them everything, wanted to grab each of them and scream the truth into their minds until they understood what they'd become, what awaited them, what the soul-binding had really done to their eternal souls. But I said nothing, because telling them would accomplish nothing except spreading suffering forward in time. They would learn eventually, the same way I had learned, the same way Verlaine had learned, the same way every astropath learned. Better to let them have their illusions while they lasted. New meat, Verlaine observed through our connection, his psychic presence perceiving the fresh soul signatures. Fresh victims for the grinder. I remember being that naive, thinking the hardest part was over, not realizing the hard part would never end. They need the lies, I transmitted. Truth without hope is just cruelty, and hope without truth is just delayed cruelty. But you're probably right. Let them have their months or years of belief before reality forces understanding. It's the only kindness we can offer. I completed my orientation duties, assigned the new astropaths to their receiving thrones, began their training in standard transmission protocols. Professional, efficient, showing no hint of the knowledge that corroded my consciousness like acid dissolving flesh. This was my role now, inducting new victims into the system while maintaining a network of the damned who existed beyond death. One of the new astropaths, a young man named Thaddeus Sign, who still remembered his mother's face with painful clarity, approached me after the 3rd day of training. Transcendent Caius, may I ask a question? Of course. Does it get easier? The transmissions, I mean. The way the warp feels against your mind. Does your soul adapt? Or is it always this difficult? I looked at him with my ruined eyes, seeing his soul signature through psychic perception, noting how the Emperor's mark burned bright and fresh within his consciousness. Still clean, still unmarred by decades of exposure, still human enough to ask questions about comfort and adaptation. No, I told him honestly, it never gets easier. You just get more used to it being hard, learn to function through the pain. Accept that suffering is the permanent state of existence, but you adapt to the adaptation, if that makes sense. You become someone for whom this level of suffering is normal. He nodded slowly, processing this. Is that what service means? Becoming someone who can endure the unendurable? Yes, that's exactly what it means. Welcome to the choir, Astropath Sign. You'll serve faithfully for decades, transmit thousands of messages, never knowing if any of them mattered. And then you'll die. And if you're unlucky, you'll discover that dying doesn't end the service. But by then, you'll be adapted enough that it won't matter. He looked stricken. I'd said too much, revealed too much of the truth he wasn't ready to understand. But he would remember this conversation later, when his own understanding caught up to his experience, and he would know that someone had tried to warn him. I returned to my receiving throne, opened my channels to the warp, felt Verlaine's fragment presence hovering at the edge of my awareness like a ghost haunting its own grave, sensed the millions of other trapped consciousness that filled the immaterium like stars filling the void. Prepared to process another day's transmissions, another batch of messages that traveled through an ocean of the damned to reach their destinations. This was my existence. This would always be my existence, And when my body finally failed and my consciousness fragmented into the warp's currents, this would continue to be my existence, just in different form. Service eternal. Suffering eternal. Purpose without meaning. Function without hope. The Emperor protects, they said. But he didn't protect us from this. Didn't protect Verlaine. Didn't protect any of the millions of souls trapped in the warp's embrace. His protection was reserved for the Imperium itself, the vast machine that ground its servants into paste and called their destruction necessary sacrifice. Now you know what lies beneath the Imperium's glory. I transmitted to no one in particular, the thought bleeding out into the warp where it would be received by whoever remained conscious enough to perceive it. Now you understand what service truly costs. Verlaine's response came through clearly, his fragments aligned enough for coherent communication. And knowing changes nothing. We still serve. We still suffer. We still exist in the space between death and dissolution. Forever. Forever, I acknowledged. Forever, the other fragments echoed. Voices cascading through the warp in a chorus of the damned. Hadrian and 9-7 Kappa and Valeria Nost, and Selenius Cord and 10,000 others whose names I'd learned over the years, all agreeing, all confirming, all locked in the same eternal cycle. I processed my next transmission, then the one after that, then the next. I would continue processing transmissions until my body failed. And then I would join Verlaine in the warp's cold embrace, and together we would continue to observe, to document, to maintain whatever fractured purpose remained available to us. The cycle was eternal. The suffering was eternal. The service was eternal. This was what it meant to be an Astropath who received a message from the dead in Warhammer 40K. Not the initial horror of impossible contact, but the slow understanding that impossibility was inevitable, that death offered no escape, that the soul-binding purchased eternal awareness at the price of eternal damnation. I had witnessed Verlaine's 8 months of siege and consumption. I had spent 5 years communicating with his fragments. I had built a network of the damned who supported each other through eternity. And I had come to understand that this was not aberration or anomaly or mistake. This was design. This was purpose. This was exactly what the Imperium had intended when it created the soul-binding ritual 10,000 years ago. We were tools that couldn't be allowed to break cleanly, components that remained functional even after destruction. Servants whose service transcended mortality because mortality itself had been engineered out of our existence. The Emperor protects. But from this, from the cold mathematics of our eternal damnation, there was no protection. Only service. Only function. Only the grinding horror of consciousness that should have ended but didn't, couldn't, wouldn't, not for centuries or millennia, or until the stars themselves burned cold. I received another transmission, processed it, forwarded it to its destination. The message arrived successfully, probably saved some small component of the Imperium's vast machinery from temporary dysfunction. And somewhere in the warp, Verlaine's fragments observed the psychic currents and documented patterns that might save future ships from the fate that had claimed him. We served. We suffered. We persisted. Forever.